United States airstrikes and airborne landings have occurred in Caracas, marking intervention in Venezuela. After midnight, impacts hit Caracas. Hours later, the United States government announced that dictator Maduro had been captured and flown out of the country. Meanwhile, the report came in that Maduro is on his way to New York, where he will be put on trial for drug and weapons offenses. In this video, we'll explain what we know so far and its impact on the current regime. And above all, how should this be assessed from an international law perspective, from a moral perspective, but also from a geopolitical perspective? As I said, all of this here in this video.
Heiliger Stroh says, "Save the most now at Holy with my code."
Trump is greatly impacting both Venezuela's and Iran's futures, where ongoing uprisings could potentially topple the government. How and what Trump has to do with it? In this video linked here for you. Venezuela first experienced attacks using long-range weapons. We have a few videos here made by residents that show impacts and secondary detonations. Presumably bombs were used here from death planes, because in Puerto Rico not only have numerous F-35s been spotted, but now also F-22s. That means the American planes were on site. Here we can see it from the hill, how the impacts are happening. By the way, one of the major military bases is supposed to be there, right where all the impacts are. Air defense systems were also struck during the attacks. We have video showing a book system at an airport. That means, at least in part, the attacks were aimed at the Venezuelan air defense systems, but combat helicopters were also used. Here we see an American attack helicopter firing at ground targets, likely to support landing troops. Damage has been reported at numerous military bases and airports. Fuerteventura, the main military base in Caracas, was hit, as well as La Carlota, the Air Force base in Caracas, El Volcán, and the news antenna that was over Caracas. The LaGuardia port, the main port of Venezuela, and also the Iguarote airport. At Iguarote airport, there was a book system. Soon after the attack, combat helicopters landed. And this is an impressive video where we can see helicopter after helicopter here, by the way, heavy Chinook transport helicopters flying a whole line of helicopters over Caracas. We saw an impact in the background, but we can't see any anti-aircraft fire, we can't see any tracer rounds, and in the videos of the airborne landings you also can't hear any heavy defensive fire. That means the defense was largely inactive during this American attack, which, as we can see, took place with airborne troops right in the capital itself. During the attack, Maduro was captured, along with his wife. This seems to show him on board the United States ship Iwo Jima. As we can see, he is handcuffed, cut off from the outside world, and wearing a tracksuit. He was captured together with his wife. The Cuban bodyguards probably didn't help him either. A recent report said he greatly increased his security with Cuban bodyguards, believing they're more loyal than his own troops. Reports indicate the United States was patrolling, and the government says they're now gathering information to locate Maduro. It also didn't help him that, according to some reports, he was allegedly moving every 4 hours. All of this happened because Maduro did not protect his personal data and did not prevent its spread. You don't have to repeat the same mistake, because today's sponsor could help you avoid United States Special Forces unexpectedly showing up and taking you away in a secret operation. If you really hate unwanted emails and calls, today's sponsor of the video can help you. Incogni has a simple business model. For a small fee, it deletes our data from the internet. There are tons of free offers on the internet that we accept, even though we know the saying, if we don't pay for the product, we are the product. All these websites and apps either show us ads or collect our personal data and sell it to data brokers. That's not just our email addresses and names, but often also our date of birth, home addresses, and our buying and browsing behavior. Every search query, every product you look at can be tracked. This data can then be used for spam. But also by companies when it comes to our insurance premiums or loans, insurance can become more expensive. Loans can be denied because you appear unreliable or careless due to visiting certain websites or specific searches on the internet. Incogni is here to prevent that. Basically, it makes sure that we don't have to pay all the costs for the things we use for free on the internet. You sign up, give the company permission to act on your behalf, and then they get to work deleting your data. I can track the progress directly, and with every visit, I get confirmation of more deleted entries. If brokers cause issues, incognito persists until my data is removed. Month after month, they continue to protect my privacy. If you also want to take back your privacy, you'll find the link in the description. By doing so, you not only support the channel, but you also get a 60% discount when you use my link. I now have an annual subscription, so they regularly delete my data. At the same time, I'm grateful that you're supporting the channel, but let's get back to the video. The whole operation was undoubtedly a masterpiece by the United States in terms of their armed forces and intelligence services. In total, 150 fighter jets were involved, and the entire operation lasted only 2.5 hours. A helicopter was hit, but it remained airworthy. There were wounded, but no fatalities. That means the Americans were able to kidnap the head of state in the capital of another nation, which knew it was a potential target. Yes, it's basically kidnapping, even if we now call it an arrest or frame it differently. Effectively, they were able to kidnap the head of state without even suffering any significant losses. The Venezuelan military was completely overwhelmed. One of the reasons for this is probably that the months of preparation caused massive exhaustion. Always staying alert isn't sustainable. In previous videos, I will link the playlist here. I have followed the preparation for today's action. And you will see how I assessed things there in advance and in the past. There I explained that, in my view, the intention is clearly a slowly growing escalation in order to force the government to give in. And at the same time, the country is put on alert, which cannot be sustained in the long run. I mentioned that in previous videos. You can imagine it like this. Of course, you can put your military on alert, but after a week or so, you either have to take action or lower the alert level again, because people want to go home again. The weapons shouldn't be lying around loaded all the time, and people want to take a shower again and not spend all their time in the trenches. An alert status can only be kept for a short time, especially when it involves the entire military. And the United States, by threatening the country for months, made sure that there must have been fatigue on the part of the military. Because of this constant threat, not only from the military but also from the regular leadership, of course. For example, Maduro may have eventually stopped staying in a different place every night. As I said, some reports claimed he would change locations every 4 hours. That must be incredibly exhausting. And at some point, if the attack doesn't happen, it's just human nature to say, well, they're not going to attack anyway. I just want to sleep at home again. That would be a good option, for example. But the other question we haven't answered yet is how much the Venezuelan military actually tried to defend itself. There is definitely a motive not to defend the government. Besides direct bribery, we shouldn't forget that the United States has put a $50 million bounty on his head. And a Venezuelan general who is responsible for talking to the United States and says, "Hey, I'll shut everything down. I'll ensure there's no strong resistance." He effectively made the arrest possible and would therefore most likely have a legitimate claim to a hefty 50 million United States dollars bounty. The military? The United States military first. Belong to the Venezuelan government. War sounded excellent, big-hearted. The willing chairman was in Alligator. The country itself has been disarmed. Currently, only the military, police, National Guard and colectivos, criminal gangs allied with the government, are armed. The general population has no weapons. That means that's how the regime was able to stay in power, because it controlled those with the weapons. The fact that they were outnumbered by those opposing the regime didn't change anything. The regime was able to continue existing in this way up until now. However, by not resisting the Americans and therefore not being destroyed, the military remains a power factor even in a possible transition and is therefore in a very good negotiating position. It's still unclear how things will proceed, but for example, if there's a change now, the military remains armed in relation to the opposition and can therefore negotiate. Whether it's about future participation in power or about amnesties in the sense of either you grant general amnesties for everything we've done, or we stage a coup and remove you, or we do something to you. That means, on the part of the military, the moment the Americans got serious, there was a real motivation not to resist, especially if the threat wasn't the conquest of the country. Where patriotism might have motivated most soldiers to fight, what if it's just a change of power? There were good reasons on the part of the Venezuelan military not to get involved themselves. The high speed and the little resistance are an indication that Maduro may have been abandoned by the military. At this point, of course, that's speculation. We'll have to see what comes out in the future, but there are at least some indications of this. Injuries and damages that have occurred with the Americans, it would probably only be attributable to the Cuban bodyguards because it's a bit less likely that they would simply let themselves be bought. Let's get to the big question. So now Maduro is on his way to the United States, where he will most likely end up in prison for a long time. Realistically, the United States will likely try to imprison him for decades. So he won't be coming back to Venezuela except maybe in his last months when he's close to dying, just like what happened here in Panama with Manuel Noriega. So what does it mean for the current regime? The three most important people after Maduro himself are the Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, and Defense Minister Vladislav. All three have survived. That's the current information. None of them have been captured. According to the latest information, there are reports emerging every hour. Rodriguez, the vice president, is said to have fled to Moscow. That's nonsense, in my view, especially since she wouldn't have had the time to flee there in the meantime, and besides, she would have had to flee by plane. With United States forces in the air and warships off the coast, that would be very risky. It simply doesn't make any sense that she has already fled to Moscow. So we come to the conclusion that the regime is effectively intact. Maduro may be gone, but everything else remains intact. The damage to the military was also guaranteed to be manageable, so the Venezuelan armed forces are more or less as intact as they were before the start of this attack. In addition, there are now numerous videos from bystanders. We can see here that even during the night, Venezuelan forces are out on the streets. We see an armored vehicle and armed personnel here. There are numerous videos of this kind. Here we can clearly say that the intention must be to prevent a coup and chaos. The opposition may have the majority of the people behind them, but as long as the military is mobilized and supports the regime, a fall of the Chavistas simply cannot be expected. The military controls the streets because they have weapons and the opposition does not. We see this. Because the military is active on the streets, it can maintain control, keep the situation under control. Even Machado's message itself won't help with that. I have briefly translated it for you here. Venezolana, the hour of freedom has come. Nicolas Maduro is now facing international justice for the cruel crimes committed against Venezuelans and citizens of many other nations. In light of his refusal to accept a negotiated solution, the government of the United States has fulfilled its promise to enforce the law. The time has come for popular sovereignty and national sovereignty to triumph in our country, where we will create order, free the political prisoners, build an extraordinary country, and bring our children back home. That is a reference to the millions of Venezuelans. I believe it's supposed to be 7 million who have fled the country since the Chavistas. We fought for years, gave everything, and it was worth it. What needed to happen is happening now. Here it is. The opposition clearly supports, the leader of the opposition clearly supports what has happened here. Previously, I've discussed this in other videos. The list is linked above. Have I covered this already? This is the hour of the citizens, of those who risked everything for democracy on July 28th. That was the choice of those who elected Edmundo González Urrutia as the legitimate president of Venezuela. He must immediately assume his constitutional mandate and be recognized by all officers and soldiers of the National Armed Forces as commander-in-chief. Today we are ready to enforce our mandate and take over power. Let's stay vigilant, active, and organized until the democratic transition, which needs everyone, is complete. To the Venezuelans within our country, be ready to set in motion what we will soon communicate to you through our official channels to the Venezuelans abroad. We need you mobilized so that you can activate governments and citizens around the world and involve them from now on in the great operation to build the new Venezuela. In these crucial hours, you have my strength, trust, and affection. Let's stay attentive. We'll be free. Let's walk with God to the end. That is their statement. There are actually a few questions regarding the rest. First, let's go back to Trump for a moment. Trump says on Fox Friends something has to be done with Mexico. The cartels would rule in Mexico. And he said he kept asking President Sheinbaum if she would allow the United States to take out the cartels. Trump, it seems, will use the attack to force concessions from others as well. Remember, he said after Venezuela, Colombia's current president would be next. People there will notice. That doesn't mean people have to tremble with fear, but at least the possibility is now a bit more on the table after the United States has demonstrated that they are willing to intervene. I've previously said Trump is effectively following a 19th century great power foreign policy. This refers to the 19th century when a few states negotiated as equals and the rest were dictated to. Then, about an hour or an hour and a half ago, there was a press conference with Trump, and in it, Trump mentioned Venezuelan oil in almost every other sentence. That definitely needs to be mentioned here, and the Venezuelan oil is supposed to help pay for, among other things, the American involvement in the country. So here as well, he wants the country itself to pay for it. He said about this, "We, the United States of America, will lead the country. If necessary, boots on the ground are also conceivable, meaning soldiers operating on the ground in Venezuela." Trump also says that Rubio has spoken with the new president and that she has already been sworn into office, and she will support whatever the United States does, and the understanding is accordingly that this is the case. Rodriguez, who is Maduro's vice president, is now in office as the new president. It's uncertain how true this is, since Rodriguez had just strongly condemned the action publicly. That was about the opposition. There it wouldn't be the president, but Edmundo. In that sense, it only makes sense if he's talking about Rodriguez, who would then suddenly be a legitimate president. Because we have to be clear here, if Donald Trump accepts Delcy Rodriguez as president, then the accusations regarding Maduro's illegitimate government are, of course, somewhat obsolete. Maduro's vice president cannot be legitimate if the president himself is not legitimate with his election. That may be that it was part of a deal also to enable an orderly transition. We have to understand that here, but it doesn't change this contradiction. The whole thing, if it was a deal, would also explain the minimal resistance. And the whole thing is further supported by Donald Trump, who stated that the United States of America would also be willing to respond with a much larger attack. The momentum has slipped down a bit now. Here's the live feed. It has adjusted. They're now prepared for a much larger second attack. That means the Americans will continue to maintain the pressure. Since last night, the United States has a strong reason to urge Rodriguez to call for new elections. Because if her predecessor was just kidnapped overnight, then of course her position is somewhat dependent on the Americans. That means in this respect, there is the possibility to exert pressure if we want to evaluate it in general terms. Everything is still open as to how things will proceed if the United States maintains the pressure. It is quite possible that the regime will allow for change. The arguments for doing this better were mentioned tonight. Militarily, Venezuela doesn't stand a chance. And the personnel, the leadership can simply be picked up in the country and then face decades in a United States prison. This will only work if the United States government maintains pressure. If so, it would be very successful. There's no other way to assess it. It would have led to hardly any or no deaths at all. It's still not clear how many deaths there have been on the ground. There may have been some, but the number will be relatively low. Especially when we compare that to other military actions, the United States has invested relatively little. They did sail around with their ships and carried out a few attacks. But overall, in terms of manpower and especially in terms of risk, the United States has invested relatively little. If democratic change takes place in Venezuela, it will probably turn the country into a United States ally precisely because the change did not begin with a bloodbath. It's not about fueling hatred in the country, but rather that the majority is against the current government. And if it is overthrown with the help of the United States of America, that should actually make the Venezuelans indebted to the United States of America for the next generation. The United States of America would succeed greatly unless the government is destroyed or decapitation strikes occur. Order can be maintained across the board and new elections can be organized since the structures for that exist. Yes, so in this case, if that's true, they would have learned from Iraq, where the entire executive branch was dismissed after the country was conquered, and the whole thing ended in chaos, because then there was no one left to administer the country, to lead the country, to maintain order. and at the same time hundreds of thousands of people who had weapons, who had military weapons, who had previously been in the military and police, were dismissed and at the same time denied any hope of future employment with the state. This, of course, drove them into the guerrilla groups, into the insurgents, into the arms of the insurgents, and in fact, very, very many of them became insurgents. So if we sum it up, the chances for a good future for Venezuela definitely exist at the moment. Details are key. Will the Americans stay interested? How will Venezuelans respond? But with the pressure the Americans have exerted and at the same time the relatively minor damage, they have a very strong argument to now exert influence on Venezuela. How should it be judged further? First, consider international law. The United States calls Maduro a criminal with an arrest warrant and labels him a narco-terrorist. That may be enough of an argument for Trump at home to avoid involving Congress. Because it's supposedly not a war but just a police action, and they were only defending the police officers who were attacked, that's why the military was involved. That's irrelevant under international law. I've already pointed that out in the videos about the drug boats. Like I said, all of this is in this list here if you're interested. The fact that Maduro is not legitimate is also irrelevant under international law. Most Western countries may not consider Maduro legitimate. All the countries marked in red here have not recognized Venezuela's last election. That means all these countries, the ones in red, do not see Maduro as the legitimate head of state of Venezuela. That is irrelevant under international law. However, that means he is not, in quotation marks, the president and does not have to be referred to as such. If you look at it from the West's perspective, because from the West's point of view, Edmundo González is the president of Venezuela. That's important for the semantics, for the designation. Whether a president was kidnapped or a criminal who leads a state, you can argue that, but from an international law perspective, that's also somewhat irrelevant because he was the de facto ruler of Venezuela. And the invitation of a United States military by the opposition did happen, at least in a certain way, but the opposition does not have effective control over the country, and therefore the invitation is not legally valid under international law. Some exceptions exist, like internationally recognized governments in exile, but these are rare, controversial, and not customary international law. So it's likely irrelevant that the opposition has technically supported this intervention. Self-defense according to the United Nations Charter is also not common. I mean, Trump can point out that drugs are killing many Americans, and that's true. However, the drugs smuggled from Venezuela mostly go to Europe, not to the United States. And even that, of course, would not justify a military intervention. As I said, I've already addressed this in the past. Humanitarian intervention is often used. The argument is at best a gray area under international law, not certain, and the United Nations Charter's prohibition on force still stands. Because the exceptions of self-defense, a mandate from the Security Council, or an invitation by a legitimate government do not apply. So under international law overall, it's at best a gray area. In some parts, it's an outright violation of the law, if we want to sum it up, clearly against international law. From the American side, that intervention violated international law. How do we want to judge this morally? A clear majority in Venezuela is against Maduro, that's beyond doubt. Giving people their freedom is undoubtedly desirable from a moral point of view. So we have to say both are possible. It is possible to say that Maduro was the illegitimate head of a junta that robbed Venezuela of its people, and it is good that Maduro is being removed. At the same time, the United States carried out an illegal military operation to remove a de facto head of state, which is also highly problematic. It's not contradictory to say it's good Maduro is gone and that Venezuela could have a chance at democracy. And at the same time, it's problematic that the United States carried out an illegal military operation combined with Trump's statements towards the Allies. And that makes the whole thing even a bit more delicate because of Trump's statements towards Canada and Denmark. With regard to Greenland, even this action is a break from the Cold War. Even during the Cold War, international law was broken, there was cooperation with dictatorships, or military interventions were carried out. And all of this was done under the pretense that it served the greater good, namely the fight against the Soviet Union. At the same time, however, there was no such conflict with close allies, as is the case now, where the territorial integrity of two close allies is being disputed and endangered. With Canada and Greenland, that's the difference here itself. Now we come to the geopolitical assessment of the Cold War. Yesterday, a Chinese delegation with the Chinese envoy for Latin America was with Nicolas Maduro. That too is a clear signal towards China. That may have influenced the timing because the operation took place last night when there was a lot going on, which is not ideal. It makes spotting helicopters and soldiers easier, especially without night vision equipment. And in most cases, the United States has the best night vision equipment. That's why it's most comfortable for them to operate in maximum darkness, which wasn't the case this time. In itself, that was highly risky, and it suggests that the timing wasn't a coincidence, but had to do with the Chinese visit. International law has only applied when enforced by the United States. Anyone who was against the world's policemen, the United States also contributed to the United States not enforcing international law. That's this point of view. If we want to make a geopolitical assessment, I've already read many today. Believing China and Russia would act because of this is naive. It's naive to believe that China and Russia would care about international law if they didn't expect any consequences from it. So we can say no. Xi Jinping doesn't need an invitation from Trump for an invasion of Taiwan, and Xi Jinping also doesn't need an American precedent of violating international law. One could even argue that today's action may have been a deterrent because it took place immediately after a meeting between Maduro and a Chinese delegation, which is probably still in Caracas right now and is therefore a signal towards Beijing, while at the same time demonstrating the United States' willingness to act. That can absolutely be compared to the attack on Assad's Syria under Donald Trump. That took place during a lunch break at a meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. There, Trump came off to lunch. Was it during lunch? He left, returned, and told Xi Jinping, "By the way, I just attacked Syria." That can absolutely be compared to that. Xi Jinping may be encouraged to attack Taiwan if the United States appears weak or its military resources, like cruise missiles, are depleted, and therefore there is no arsenal left to stop the Chinese. Or if the military resources are tied up on the mainland of East Asia and therefore cannot intervene. Or if Xi believes that the United States does not want to protect Taiwan. Today's action may have given Xi Jinping an argument that he can tell those who are looking for a justification to rationalize China's attack on Taiwan. But to say that Xi would attack Taiwan because of this now, pretending as if Red China would otherwise care about international law. China doesn't conquer the Senkaku Islands, which belong to Japan, because international law prevents it and the Chinese respect it, but China conquers the Senkaku Islands. Not because the Japanese armed forces exist, are of relevant strength, and are allied with the United States armed forces. We can also ask what international law says to China about its South China Sea actions. And I can give you a spoiler if you want to look it up yourself. There were, among other things, court rulings. The fact that China's actions are illegal doesn't stop the Chinese, though. So how is China being stopped there? That's what we want to ask. Did international law stop Russia in Moldova, Georgia, or Ukraine? China and Russia don't need the pretext of United States intervention in Venezuela if they want to break the international order. They already do it whenever they want and believe they can get away with it. That doesn't change the fact that this United States attack is a new breach. Even the fact that the others do it, saying it doesn't affect China or Russia, but we should still say yes, it was against international law. What the United States of America just did, we've already done several times here in this video. At the same time, the emphasis on oil, and if you watch the press conference, it really feels like every other sentence Trump talks about Venezuelan oil. Of course, that endangers and complicates the pretext of a humanitarian action for the benefit of the Venezuelan people. And the simultaneous threatening of allies by the United States is unique. As I said, that didn't even happen during the Cold War, when they worked with some unsavory characters, as long as the big picture made sense. As I said before, Trump again proves he views himself as the ruler of a 19th century great power, who negotiates with other states as equals, those he considers worthy of him. We can compare it in the 19th century to Prussia, Austria, France, Russia, and Great Britain. With a bit of luck, maybe also the Italians and Austria-Hungary. Not sure if I said this, but they made the final decision. And that's how Trump acts, that's how Trump's foreign policy is held together, including regarding Ukraine, which we've discussed several times. He sits at the table with the big players. The rest is just dessert, already decided. What about you? What do you think? If a democratic change happens thanks to the United States of America was the open breach of international law, which did occur, worth it. Share your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this, please give a thumbs up. If you're new, please subscribe and click the bell. And don't forget to subscribe to Incognit if you don't want United States Special Forces to pick you up at home because your data wasn't deleted from the internet. That's all for now. Thanks for your attention. See you soon. At this point, I'd also like to thank the supporters on Patreon as well as the members here on YouTube. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Kamp and Lieutenants Jans von Eck and Uwe Dufresne. Nickname Tubib Carsten Schulz. Gulasch Nasher 4000, Tequila 42, Badass Lawyer, Matt, Brick, Robert Viel, Vision, Soundlab, Möter, Halbmensch, Halbköter, Mahamori, Burtonment, Jenisku Anti-X, Sascha Müller, Cunningham, Oistress. Thank you all. This wouldn't be possible without you.